Good afternoon, colleagues, and welcome to the 2023 version of the BFAP Baseline. My name is Matlo Kalaba, and I'm so far talking to the audience in the house. Online, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, and good night from wherever you're joining us around the globe. We sincerely appreciate you taking time and joining us in this hour and the next 2 to 3 hours of information session, sharing, as well as the discussions. As I mentioned, my name is Matlu Kalaba, and I'm the senior analyst at BFAP. Maybe to start with those in the house, there are just a couple of housekeeping issues that we just need to be reminded of. So the entry and exit are on my left, so we're using only one entry. So, and I can see some of the empty chairs toward this side. So if people on my extreme left, if they can either make space or be willing to allow others to pass through to get seats to the right, that would be really helpful. And that's also the exit that we'll be using to go out. Secondly, we have bathrooms. Also, they are accessible through the door on my left. Having taken care of those housekeeping issues, I think it's about time that we get to the day's activities. When we were welcoming some of the guests coming in, I won't mention the names, one of them basically said, "Has it been 20 years? Boy, I am old." Believe me, we all feel this way. But it has really been 20 years. BFAP has come a long way, and the industry, government, organizations, partners have been part of this journey and this process over time. And BFAP would not be here without those. The list of all the collaborators, partners, and everyone we've worked with, if I were to go through that, we might as well just spend the anniversary talking about them. So all of you, you are highly and sincerely appreciated, and thank you for being part of the BFAP family. Now, over the 20-year period, quite a lot has happened in terms of the baseline, but in terms of the general economic and policy analysis. We have had droughts, some as severe as nothing that was seen in our lifetimes. There's been financial crisis of proportions similar to those seen in the 1930s. There have been diseases, pests. There have been wars. Maybe there are still wars. There have been pandemics. And all these shocks and all these activities, they always send a caution to the work that is done through the baseline and the outlook, because it certainly changes the way you see 10 years from when we published the book. However, it is also a moment of realization that the baseline and the outlook need to be used for also eventualities of that nature, to say something happened. We're not looking at the world or the future the way we were 6 months ago or 2 years ago. How do we adapt? How do we adjust to to that just happened? But I can talk a lot and for even longer. However, there is one person who was at the first baseline presentation, the very first of the 20. And he has been at each and every one of those in between. And I'm going to call Fedi Maya, who is also the managing director for BFAP, to come and set the scene for us. Fedi, over to you.
Thanks very much, Matlo, and good afternoon, colleagues. Great to have you here, and for all the online guests and friends, as always, a great privilege to do this. 20 years, it's been amazing. The grey hair here is definitely not due to BFAP. maybe some master plan negotiations, but that's on the side note. This is definitely because I've got 3 boys driving around with a bucky or a tractor on the farm, and that sometimes gives you gray hair. It's a great privilege. We want to get right into it. We have a lot to cover, and if we can have the slides up, there we go. So first of all, I wanted to talk to you about the baseline. Why do we do a baseline, and why I've been doing this for the last 20 years? And this is a very simple graph, and I think concepts that most of you have dealt with, or maybe in a scenario session in your business, in government. 3 important concepts. It's the hindsight, the insight, and the foresight. And there are distinct differences. In this graph, you have on your x-axis your time. In other words, the further you move ahead, what happens to complexity? It becomes far more complex. So if we want to have a projection and a forecast on what we're going to drink tonight, we're very certain about it, and it's in the real time, it's now. If we want to have a look at what happened in the past, we have good data in many cases. We can analyze that data, we can look at it, we have time series trends, it explains to us what happened in the past. But if you want to go into the future and the foresighting part, that's where things become very complex. And there's basically a range of solutions, potential outcomes that you could have. And that's a reason for a baseline, is to say, if we would if we have certain assumptions, if we would take our relationships in the past, what do we see in front of us? So hindsight remains a very important tool. It allows us to analyze the data, to do the analytics, and what can we get out of it? We can learn what should have we done differently, and how can we use that to inform our future and our decisions that we make. The insight, the current now, is becoming a lot more complex, and the world has become more complex. It's a cliche, but it's true. There's a lot more data coming to us. With a mechanization colleague sitting here, the machines are generating a lot more information. Satellites are generating a lot more information. So the analytics around the current now and here is getting more complex, and not even to talk about the foresighting the future. In other words, what are the alternative options? What are the key drivers? And most importantly, if we understand some of those outcomes, what can we do now to change the future? And that's what we want to talk about today. Present globally, we'll have Julian, we have Tracy talking about the local market, we'll talk about the African dynamics and context from Holger's side, from FAO, and Matlo will come in and talk about what we're doing also from BFAP side on the continent. So these complexities are changing constantly. And every year at the baseline, we come and we bring, and we want to talk about these complexities. We want to say, given latest information, our interpretation of these external drivers, mega external drivers that are shaping our future, what could be the potential impact? And again, how can we act on those to change the baseline? So we need to talk about changing the baseline. So how do we do this? This is our world of analytical, our analytical life cycle. And this is an important figure to look at. Just in terms of time that we spent on which component of our analytics, and then the complexity rapidly increases. So just have a look at I can see different colors. Let me just get back here. So there we can see. There we go. So that green bar there is complexity, and it increases as you're moving into your modeling space. But look how much time does it take to get into the modeling space. And that's always if we do the training, capacity building, 70% of our time is just cleaning data, understanding the data, doing basic analytics around the data. And then, yes, the modeling is important. And what's the last part that you cannot miss is the communication of the message. And that might be a little bit less complex than a model, but it certainly requires a lot of time. So to talk about the message, to have a great audience like you to ask questions and to say, but you know what, these are alternatives. Have you taken this into consideration? And that's why these partnerships and networks for BFAP are so important. So it's not a group of analysts sitting behind their desks. We want to be out there. We are in the market. we're with government, and this is where we build the analytics and the qualitative, the insights into our data and the foresighting around it. It's not only about the data, it's about this context that within which you have to generate your baseline. And what are the 4 key important factors here? We have our natural resource potential. This is what we have, this is what our Creator has given us, and we need to be the custodians of what's been given to us. That's the natural resources. We have the economy. Markets are critical. We need to take a market-led approach. We always talk about a market-led approach. It's important to create the sustainability and the competitiveness. We have people. That little table there, just to eyeball it, we have the farmers. We have the commercial farmers. We have over 1 million households, 1.3 million households, or 2.3 million households, if you add all of them together, involved in agriculture. In the middle, we have small scale, large scale, commercial, informal farmers. We have consumers. And this is the poverty map on this side. So we need to feed a nation. South Africa is one of the most unequal countries in the world. And within this context, the solutions, the options, the opportunities that we generate take this into consideration. Agriculture and agro-processing has outperformed other sectors in the economy in recent years. So colleagues, this is an important message to carry as agriculture economists or as agribusiness and agriculture. Agronomists, go and tell the story. Look at this over here. In the recent years, so agriculture's share of the economy has been declining, which is typical in a first world developed structured economy where you have bigger value add beyond the farm gate. This is primary agriculture. But look at these recent years. Amazing performance by the agriculture sector. Rapidly increasing and actually outperforming the rest of the economy and growing its share of the total economy. And the same for agro-processing. Also growing faster than what we've seen in the rest of the industrial space and manufacturing space. The reality, however, is if we look in front of us, we have a lot of challenges. So we know about load shedding, the weak consumer demand, the declining prices internationally, and we see local prices coming down. We have infrastructure challenges. We have service delivery challenges. We have ports and logistics that are congested, not being able to take the volume of produce that we are pushing into the market. So if we put all of this together, and Tracy will take you through a lot of detail on how do we get to this basic picture, but then going in front of us, this is the real ag GDP. Doesn't look too great for the next 3-4 years until 2027, 28. Then only we see this kind of positive turnout. Given the current situations, in other words, projecting what we currently have with all the constraints, opportunities that we're going to look at in terms of global markets, this is the picture that we're looking at. The question is, can we change the outcome? In order to do that, we need to take into consideration what goes into a baseline. And this is obviously something that at each baseline, I have colleagues asking, what did you say last year? So now we are going bold, we're going to say, what did we say 10 years ago and 20 years ago? So this is a bit of fun that we're going to have here for those of you who enjoy numbers. So just 3 quick slides. What I'm going to do is we're going to compare actual versus forecast. What did we say in 2003 about maize yields? And our average forecast, if we take the average of that line there, that was about 3.5 tons per hectare. The actual average yield for that period was 3.85. So that was our forecast, this was actual, so yields grew a bit faster. Then we came in, I'm jumping to 2013. Our projection was an average yield of about 5.2. It came out at 4.8. But on average, if you just take at the growth rate, it was still faster. So we had these mega bumps here in 15 and 16, which is playing around a little bit with that average, but still yields on average growing at a fast rate. Look at soybeans. Initially, those first 10 years, a bit faster than what actually happened. In the last 10 years, look at that fast growth rate of average yields in soybeans. Okay, so growing a bit faster than what we had in the baseline. Technology, so we had a general, if you would talk to seed companies, that's what they would give you as an estimate. This is what they're breeding for. But then obviously you have farming practices. Climate also plays a big role in terms of your output. But clearly there you can get a feel for yields are very important, assumption that we make and the generation that we do. Another very important one, and this is one of our biggest, or the most important, if you think about structurally the model, the most important consumption component is chicken consumption. Okay? So if we look at chicken use in South Africa, at that time, in 2003, we were sitting at about 1.1 million tons of actual chicken consumption. Our projection was lying at 1.4 million tons, just over 1.4, and actual turned out to be at 1.5. So relatively close, 10 years ahead. Where would chicken consumption grow? At that time, look at the GDP. GDP in 2003 was running at 3%. Our macroeconomic forecasters, and there are various companies, we don't do macroeconomic forecasting, so we take that as an exogenous assumption in our model. The projection was about 2.5. That was a forecast. What turned out? 29% faster. The average growth rate over that period was almost 3.3, 3.4%. So you can clearly see that growth rate being faster also initiated a faster growth in consumption. So we had a lot of more people going into a higher income bracket being able to afford meat. The opposite is actually true for the next period. Look at that economic forecast at 3.5. What did it turn out to be? Less than 1%. So a big drop in economic activity in South Africa over the last 10 years. We obviously had COVID also in that period. This was our forecast that we built into the model, and there you can see the result. So we overestimated chicken consumption. We were projecting from a 1.8 up to 2.3, and it ended up being about just over almost 2.1 million tons. So this gives you a bit of a feel. If you think about a baseline, what goes into a baseline, the assumptions around it are key, and those are the ones that we can build a scenario on, different outcomes to drive these pictures. And the last one, just to have fun for the maize farmers here in the audience, or anyone who's consuming maize, we need to talk about maize prices because that's the first question. If you would go to a farmer's day and you would present it, they want to know, what is die mielieprys volgende jaar? And I always tell them, guys, this is a very difficult question. But so let's have a look. If we just do a brief one around maize prices, 2003 actual prices at 1,000 Rand. We projected by 2013 or 12, 10 years ahead, it would be about 1,400, and it was about 1,500. So we're about 9% out on the maize price 10 years ahead. What went in? We all understand these markets, world price and exchange rate are important. Got the exchange rate not bad for a highly volatile exchange rate. Overestimated, or our assumption, and again, these are the macro forecasters, they can take the credit for that. A little bit overestimated, or it was a bit stronger than anticipated. Look at the world price. At that time, maize prices at $100, the projection was about 140, it turned out to be about 160. So higher world prices. And if we quickly look at our more recent period, 2013 to 2022, there we actually underestimated. The South African maize price turned out to be higher than what we had. But look at that depreciation in the exchange rate. So big, so that underestimation, we were projecting maize prices of around about 2,500 Rand a ton. It turned out to be about 3,000 Rand a ton on average. And the biggest drive for that was coming mainly from the exchange rate, which weakened much faster than what we had in the model. So I hope this gives you a bit of a feel in terms of baseline, what goes in, why do we do it? So the why do we do it, and this comes back to the question, can we change the baseline? Can we change this flat line? And I want to give you just a quick few examples, and Julian, then I'll switch over to you. So the first one is the one that we are always keen to talk about, because this is probably one of the biggest success stories, at least on the grains and oilseed side, is what's happened to the integrated soya value chain. I talk about integrated because we think about these integrated chains all the way to the chicken and the poultry market. So this was the scenario that we developed in 2008 in collaboration with PRF. At the time, soybean production was at 264,000 tons. 2008, our projection was that it could grow by threefold. Okay, so we were saying, and this was, we're going 10 years ahead, and our projection was 900,000 tons by 2017. It's a published report, you can go and have a look at it. So here were the scenarios that were developed, and we said one of the key elements you'll remember at that time, crushing capacity still was very low in South Africa, but we had a clear opportunity to do this. And the scenario developed around dramatic increase in crushing capacity and avoiding a recession. That was before we had the recession, so we didn't quite avoid it. We did have a recession, but it was definitely not a long, severe global recession. It was a kind of a bump down and up. And that was scenario 4. So that was our most bullish one. So what happened in reality? We hit that target 3 years earlier. Instead of 2017, we got to 900,000 tons already in 2014. Production's estimated at 2.8 million tons in the current season. And since April 2023, SA is self-sufficient on meal and beans for the first time. So for the first time in history, we've been importing a lot of meal, and that was ultimately getting to that target where we can actually be self-sufficient. So discounts are significant enough in the inland that we can drive meal all the way down to the coastal areas, and if we can get our rail company to participate in a program to get rail going, we could actually get it to many of those coastal areas, especially Western Cape, more effectively. Another example of changing a baseline, the NDP, 2030. In the NDP, the big focus was on jobs and growth, and many of you still remember that famous matrix of commodities and just a focus on growth potential and which are the labor-intensive ones. And there you can see, we don't have to go into all the detail, but we kind of had at that time, 2011, the soybeans, the poultry, the eggs, the high growers here, Max, pecans, avos. At the time, our projection was taking natural resource potential into consideration, looking at market space. Our projection was a total expansion of 140,000 hectares of high-value export crops. Okay? And that was by 2030. This target was achieved in 2022. So 8 years earlier, if you look in the graph on the right-hand side, from about this cluster of high-value crops there, going from 260,000 hectares to just over 400,000 hectares. If you work with an average investment of around about 800 to 1 million rand a hectare for these intensive crops, that's a big investment and coming very fast. So if there's opportunity for growth, it can happen, but things need to work together. There needs to be a partnership, and we need to identify it and go for it. And obviously, this expansion was very important. It was achieved through efficiency gains in water. Doesn't necessarily mean we use more water, we use more efficient use of the water. And we do crop substitutions, the higher value crops, they have the bigger markets. Those are ones that we are going for. So last slide, and then over to our global markets, is just in short. So we make use of this baseline to generate one potential outcome for the future under current realities. And the idea is then to say, how can we actually change this? If this is the reality that we have ahead of us, can we change this? And that's where the macroeconomic assumptions, the policy assumptions, and basically building a picture of alternative outcomes. So this is just another example of what we did for a mining exercise. And then you can create these alternative outcomes. There's actually one specific outcome. Look at the exchange rate assumption. If you build those into a Brent crude, a world price, a GDP exchange rate, that's how you can get your alternative outcomes for your baseline. That's it from my side. Julian, if we can have a view on the global markets. So this just gives a bit of an introduction, and we'll have Julian talking about the global markets, and then we'll have Tracy talking about the local markets. Thanks very much.
Well, first of all, thanks very much for the opportunity to speak here again. It's a real pleasure to come here always. Pat Westhoff sends his apologies for not being here. He'd love to have been here, especially this year, given the celebrations. He's actually attending another anniversary celebration for our Texas partners at the moment. I got the better side of this, I think, by coming to here, definitely. So what I'm going to do today is talk a bit about agricultural markets, global markets, and what's impacting things on the short run, and try and pull out some of our longer run drivers. And then I'm going to talk about the policy environment as well and try and make a link between those two things. So we do an outlook as well. Our outlook is released earlier on in the year. You can see my publication up here, our publication up here. It was released in March. So you might have noticed things have changed a little bit since March. So I'm not going to use many of the figures that come from that publication. Actually, next week, we're all going to get together. We're going to run the models again and produce a new outlook. So sometime, hopefully in the next couple of weeks, you'll see an update to this, which will have more information on it. So you'll be able to access that through our website. One of the things that have been driving things and why things are different are obviously weather. Weather is the key thing here driving the short-run markets at the moment. And we've seen some pretty extreme weather impacts here over this growing season and this year so far. In the US, for example, where I am in Columbia, Missouri, which is right in the middle of the US. We had a big drought here coming up until the beginning of August. We were in the highest state of drought, I think, in a lot of places around us. And then so far this August, we've had a lot of moisture, which has meant that we might be getting a record wet August after having an extreme drought beforehand. So if you drive north from Columbia up towards the main corn growing areas, you'll see some patchy corn. Some people do well where they've got some rain, some others not so well. So that's been the corn. The rain was too late for the corn. I think it's in time for some of the beans. So you'll maybe see some improvements in forecasts for the bean crop here in the soybean crop for here in the US. In Europe as well, we've had drought in the south there. I've got dryness across Europe, but a lot of that's been replaced by rain. I speak to my parents. My parents live in Shrewsbury in England, and they've had remarkably similar weather to we had in Columbia, Missouri. In England, they've had the hottest June on record, followed by the wettest July. So it's kind of weird to me that how those two things so far apart can be similar. When you look at I'll touch on the short-term outlook here in a second. That's reliant on big crops coming from South America that are going to be impacted by El Nino. But the other thing, obviously, that's been impacted markets here is Ukraine. Just today, a report written by Pat Westhoff was published in Choices magazine, which I think everybody can access online. So if you want more detail and an analysis of how that has impacted markets, then that's available out there at the moment. For now, I've just got on here what came out on last week's WASDE from the USDA and what they're expecting in their global projections to happen in Ukraine here. And it's interesting to look. The solid bars on here are production. Blue is wheat, green is corn, and then you've got exports across the top. So even though production dropped pretty heavily in 22-23, I think there's been some surprise at the volume of product that's been able to come out of Ukraine for wheat and corn, but also for things like sunflower as well. Some of that's been pulling down stocks. Obviously, with the ending of the agreement and an increase in hostilities there, we're probably expecting trade to drop. So that's going to be an area of uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen next year. This is going to have long-run impacts. Even if the conflict is ended, there's been destruction of facilities, disruption in transportation infrastructure. That's going to mean that this is going to have implications that reach into the future here. So generally, it's a difficult thing for us to assume what to do in our outlook. We have no idea what's going to happen here. So just for the sake of assuming something, we generally think over the next few years that things can return to somewhere near normal or whatever. But that's going to be something that's going to have a very big impact. And what I've done is, when I've pulled out the WASDE figures for next year here, I've broken out Ukraine here so we can see whereabouts it's impacting markets. So you can see for at the top there on the right, I have the latest projections from WASDE for maize here. And you can see they revised maize down a little bit this time around relative to July because of some of the weather issues around the world. So we're just below another record crop. But we're still, this is the second biggest crop on record here. For the US, we're having, we've had problems with drought, but that's only in some parts of the Midwest there. And also we planted a lot of corn this year. That's 94 million acres of corn here, so that was pretty hard. So we're actually going to have an increased amount of corn coming out from the US, and coupled with Brazil, those figures kind of dwarfed Ukraine. So even Ukraine has dropped their production levels. The impact on the corn market is much less than on some of the other crops. So we've got ending stocks going up, and what I've done is I've put in yesterday's futures prices here, just as a guide of where we are. So over the longer term, the futures prices on here are probably in the range where we've been projected in the last few baselines. We're talking about $200 corn, maybe a bit higher, and something like $230 wheat, maybe a bit higher there. I don't know where we're going to come out next week when we redo the numbers, but I wouldn't be surprised if we weren't too far away from those. So what we're really talking about is a situation where prices are lower than they've been over the last couple of years, but maybe higher than they've been in the preceding decade for those things there. For wheat, obviously, Ukraine has a bigger part of the global market, but you can see on there that EU and Russia themselves have both stepped up in their production here, producing more there to offset the drop in the Ukraine production. So we're still having more wheat next year coming out. Just a bit of an abstract way of looking at what's happening on the farm here. This is just for the US, and this is from March, so this will change in our next projections here. Dotted line are revenues. On the bottom here, we have some of the variable expenses here. It doesn't include land or machinery. If you go back to 14-15 up until 2018, low corn prices means the gap between those lines were pretty low. Higher prices now widen the gap. We have seen an increase in costs here. These are crop years here, so 22-23 is the crop that was harvested in 22. That's why 23 is kind of high for expenses for fertilizer. That's for the crop that's in the ground at the moment. Fertilizer costs actually are down there, but other costs have kept the total cost high. So over time, we're expecting a reduction in fertilizer prices. Those have happened already. We've seen fertilizer prices come down, but other costs staying pretty high in the future period. That's part of the reason why we have prices in the future higher than we might have seen over the past decade here, settling higher than that. Since 2018, also, we've only had below-trend corn yields. So you can imagine this year, if we'd have actually had a great corn yield, we planted all that corn, then the story would be very different. We'd have a much bigger drop in that line. Obviously, in our projections, we assume average year, normal weather for our projections, and so we end up with a bigger margin there for the future years for corn. Another big reason why the prices are higher is because of the demand from China. China has been importing a lot more corn obviously than it used to do historically, and that's pushing the prices up. We're expecting that to continue into the future. So corn, a big driver of our story. China, a big driver of our story for grains and for things like soybean meal. I've got oil seeds up here. A similar situation for those. In the US, probably a bit better yields this year, but we planted bean area with corn this year. So we see our production going down. Again, we're relying on a big crop coming out of South America to make that up. We have a probably well-supplied oilseed market, which has seen the oilseed prices drop. What I've done here for the 22-23 year, that's the crop year according to, for the US, that's October, September crop years. All I've done is assume that for the rest of the year, the current price stays in place. So current market prices are actually below those at the moment. And for our medium term here, I think in the past we've shown sunflower prices. I think the last time we did these, they were around 530 or something. Our soybean prices were a bit lower than that going out into the future. You can see here, again, ending stocks for soybeans increasing, while ending stocks for sunflower are going down. Ukraine as well, playing a big part of sunflower markets. Part of the reason why the sunflower hit from Ukraine hasn't been felt more keenly is if we look at sunflower area here, these I've pulled out EU because there's some interesting stories for each of these. The middle one is sunflower here. You can see that after averaging just over 4 million hectares of sunflower in the EU, we've seen a bump up to over 5 million hectares here for the last couple of years for sunflower. So a bit more sunflower coming out of the EU. The EU put a policy in place to increase protein crop area. That has increased our soybeans up to about 1 million hectares, but we don't expect that's going to get much bigger into the future. And you can see that in post-2018, there was a big drop in rapeseed area as some of the conditions, what you could plant for rapeseed, were changed. We've seen that rise again in recent years here as people adjust to that change, and probably on the back of high prices too. One of the key drivers here is going to be biofuels. Probably the last time I was here and gave a presentation, I said, well, there's not going to be much change in the US and the EU here, and it won't be as big a driver as it was, back at the beginning of the BFAP baselines. But we've seen in the last year, because of policy changes in the US and the big demand for renewable diesel, that had a big impact on oilseed markets and vegetable oil prices earlier on in the year, when the EPA said that they were going to have a lower requirement for that than many people in the market thought. That was driving it. So this was one of the big things back in January that was driving our markets, was what assumption we made about biodiesel in the US. And that was impacting everything else. It impacts the demand for oil, that impacts the demand for the beans, and that impacts other oilseeds and other crops as well. So this was a big driver, and it's going to continue to be in the future. We have ethanol pretty flat at the moment, but that all depends on electrification of the vehicle fleet. If we see a fast electrification, less need for fuel, and that will lead to a drop in biofuels as well. So that's going to be a key driver going forward. If we think about meat prices here, meat prices also have been up. We had record levels here. So this is from the FAO. For each of the different years. The top year is 2022, and the red dotted line is what's happened so far this year. So we've seen prices coming down a little bit. We'd expect chicken and pork prices to follow feed prices to come down relatively quickly. Now, obviously, the markets are less integrated than they are for cereals, especially for beef. So your experience for beef has been very different from the UK, from the EU and the US, where we've had strong demand post-COVID, pulling up prices. But because of a drought, for example, in the US, our cattle herd in the US was still decreasing, I think, our cow numbers. So we haven't been able to react to that. So we've got very high prices there that we think are going to persist for longer. The lower prices of other meats will pull those down, but I think in the next few years, especially in the EU and the US, we're likely to see pretty high beef prices. Again, China is a huge part of this and has driven the pork market in particular over the last few years. I was just looking at the USDA PS&D figures for data, and so if you take the last 5 years, the additional pork that's on the market in China is equivalent to the whole production of the US. So really what we assume about some countries doesn't really matter about as how much happens in China. China's been driving everything over the last 10 years, especially probably the last 20 years, and we think that that's probably going to happen in the future here. Also, it's really impacted dairy. This is my job is to do dairy, and this was an area where I've been very wrong this year. I mean, we look at long-run milk production and we say, okay, EU, New Zealand, Australia, all of those countries are likely to restrict their production because they're trying to meet climate change goals. So their cow numbers are fixed. So we'd be going to the US people and saying, I'm always like, yes, your export markets, you're going to have a lot of success in export markets here because the US has been increasing dairy production. But what happened this year? China has reduced the amount of dairy product it's been purchasing, and you can see what's happened on the red line there. A significant decrease in prices. Again, if you look at what China has done with production over the last 5 years, they've added another Canada in terms of dairy production. So we're just talking about massive changes, and that's part of the reason why they're importing corn, and part of the reason why our long-run corn prices are higher than they have been in the past. So this is good news if you're an exporter of soybean meal or corn. Bad news if you're an exporter of meat or dairy. What they choose to do in the future regarding their mix of producing feed or producing meat is obviously going to be a big driver of what goes on there. Just to speak a little bit about policy here, I've got on here U.S. expenditure on agricultural support. The blue, the yellow, and the green are all part of what's in the Farm Bill. You can see they vary over time. The yellow is the orange is our crop insurance subsidies, which have increased over time. The thing to point out here on these ones is, in the last few years under the Trump administration, there was a lot of extra money that was put into this sector that increased. So, we've had higher prices. We've also had higher payments here that have fed into the sector. And that's had an impact on the sector too. When we got a Farm Bill coming up, I think both there's it's not like other policies and other discussions. These tend to be bipartisan. So we'd expect there would be an agreement here. I think people are working towards an agreement. The main takeaway from the US is there's probably likely to change expenditure, but they're not going to be that important in terms of production or price impacts. Whereas what we see in Europe is the opposite here. We're expecting that the EU changes are actually going to have an impact on markets. But, whereas in the past we always thought of your EU support boosting production, here we're looking at policy changes reducing production, increasing costs for producers. And that tends to, that means another part of that is going to be that as producers are forced to meet these higher standards, they're going to be an increase in calls for more protection there. So one thing we can think about is, what's the interlinkage between policy and these market changes themselves? We think that we're having more shocks, we're having less response in production and consumption to shocks, so that's leading to more volatility in the market. One policy response has been an increase in the more frequent use of export controls there. So that's been, especially from India, we've seen that in the rice market here. We can see big increases in prices there. We've also seen input price disruption. In the US, they may look at trying to address find a way of helping producers deal with those input price changes. But I don't think there's enough money there to put a whole big new expensive scheme in place. And for Europe, consumers are putting more requirements on the way that food is produced. So the main thing I was wanting to link this all into was a real change in the trading environment here. I mean, what we used to do when BFAP started 20 years ago, we were in an environment where we were just starting the Doha round, right? We were going to keep cutting tariffs, and I think that everybody was thinking, okay, it's just a matter of time. We're gradually eliminating tariffs and trade barriers. We're moving towards free trade. Well, especially over the last couple of years, it doesn't look as if we're doing that anymore. Even as tariffs have reduced, these non-tariff barriers have become more important. So the existing ones are more visible, and the new ones have come into, there's been pressure for the new ones to come into effect. So an example of this might be the citrus here, where you negotiate extra market access, and then producers in the European Union seek more protection, and then there's a non-tariff barrier put in place. And in the US, we've seen the same thing with maize. NAFTA liberalized the maize market. Now the Mexicans are bringing in restrictions on GMO corn. So you see this thing happening all the time. And COVID has kind of added to this. I think it's led to calls for self-sufficiency and more focus on domestic security. So we think that, this is going to be a feature of what's going on. So on the one hand, we have more volatile markets. At the same time, we're likely to have more trade disputes. The WTO has become weaker, and so how are those going to be dealt with? And there's a trend towards more deals, more than free trade agreements. How that impacts you is going to be a mixed bag, I think. We're already looking into a renegotiation of AGOA, or even though the US has become more protectionist, they also can't produce everything they need, and they're looking for sources for products from outside of China. So that's one side of things, and hopefully that way, there can be more agreements there, and then you can get negotiate access for other products as well as part of those new agreements. So basically, that's what we have: more volatile markets and potentially more ad hoc trade restrictions. So if you're an exporter, that has the potential for being a very volatile. An increase in volatility here in the future that you might face. Sorry, I went well over my time then, but I'd just like to say thank you again for the group and everything they've done here. And don't hesitate to contact us if you have any questions or anything. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Julian. Good afternoon, everyone. Great to see so many familiar faces, and good morning to our international guests watching online. I'm never sure how I get myself into this, having to present the entire baseline to you in 45 minutes, but we'll give it our best shot. The good news is Julian's covered most of the international dynamics, so that helps. We don't have to go there. The other good news is that being the 20th baseline, we've got practically our entire team here, so I am going to present to you everything that I can, and then we're going to take a coffee break, and I'm sure they'll be happy to answer all the difficult questions for you through that break. So let's go. Let's have a look. I thought I'd start just with a few realities. I think doing this baseline, we've been doing it for some years now, and it feels like it gets more and more uncertain, but I think this year's been particularly difficult, just given the point that we're starting from and everything that's going on in the world. So a few realities that are out there that will influence us and that drive the baseline that you see. First is, of course, economic pressure with ample downside risk that holds both internationally and in South Africa. So, of course, the world's trying to get through to deal with inflation. A lot of actions being taken that's a bit constraining to growth. China's recovery is slow, but then also in South Africa, we've got a number of structural challenges. So it's been this ongoing effort to accelerate growth in quite a difficult environment. And of course, what also influences that is the ongoing war in Ukraine. So Julian has touched on that. It influences both the macroeconomic picture, it influences world prices, and of course, there was an initial big response which sort of settled down. But then we've had the Black Sea Grain Initiative not renewed, and there's this sort of new uncertainty and unease in the market related to that. The other, Julian's just described beautifully in this new trade environment where international trade finds itself. So, post-pandemic and with the war and everything going on, we're seeing a lot more countries looking inward. And instead of saying free trade, open up trade, make trade easier, it's actually becoming progressively more and more difficult. And of course, for South Africa, which exports so much of our agricultural products, that's a critical thing that influences our markets. The other is, of course, weather. I don't need to say anything about the weather. This is a baseline, so we conveniently assume that the weather is going to be normal. But what we need to remember is that there will be volatility around what we show today as a result of these weather conditions. So that's always worth remembering, and I think in our own context, with the strong El Nino being projected for the coming season, it's always worth just remembering. And then, of course, there's a number of challenges that Ferdy already mentioned that influence our sector in particular. I'm thinking port and logistics, service delivery challenges, Eskom, the load shedding situation, and, of course, also the animal health biosecurity situation. So bear that in mind, everything up on the screen there, the big picture, as we go through the slides. I think Ferdy's already showed you the ag GDP. So I'll go straight to the bit more disaggregated view. What we've got on screen at the top there is the gross value of agricultural production. So this is just revenue. Doesn't account for costs, but it breaks down for you which industries have been performing well and which ones have been struggling. And I think if we look back over the last 2-3 years, where agriculture was the star in the economy, it's field crops that was the star within agriculture, right? So this is where we benefited from good yields, strong prices coming from global levels. If you look at the other sectors, if you look at something like horticulture and animal products, which have grown strongly historically, they've actually been very flat in the last few years. So this is something worth considering. And also, if we look forward and the world that Julian described, where world prices start to come down, our field crops don't look so good anymore. And I think that's part of why we see the picture that Ferdy showed, which is incredibly flat, particularly in the short term. Of course, the green ones, the animal products, that's the one we probably will look to the most in order, to ignite growth. That's the biggest one. It's half of agriculture in South Africa. And then we also have growth. We have a lot of potential on the horticultural side as well. We have huge volumes coming into the market. If we can find a market for those volumes at sustainable prices, there's definitely significant opportunity that we can unlock there. So I won't stand still here. This is just a snapshot. It's basically what Julian's been talking about, but just have a look. This is the FAO Food Price Index. Just have a look at how prices ran up. The reality is that for most of the last year, prices have been coming down since the second quarter of 2022. In South Africa, some of that was offset by exchange rate dynamics, but this is what's been happening in the world, and this is the reality that we face. Going forward, it's been mentioned already, there's a number of uncertainties that influences that path. One is the war, one is renewable energy, the animal health situation globally, the weather conditions globally. I like Julian's spinning wheel that he had there. It seems very apt for what we find. This trade policy environment, and again, the global economy. So these are all things just worth keeping in mind as we go through the outlook. Looking in locally, I thought I'd take a trip down memory lane as well, given that Fadi had such fun looking at the old outlooks. This is a graph that we used to show when I started getting involved in the baseline. It's the LSM, so it's the share of the South African population falling in low income, middle income, and affluent income groups. And as you see, we're declining basically from 2005 to 2014. Lower income groups getting smaller, middle income groups getting bigger, and your affluent group getting bigger as well. So this is a nice story, and this is what was also driving the outlook outperforming in many instances, the actual outperforming the outlook that we showed. If we fast forward to the current, we've got there real disposable income of households in the bottom left, nominal terms in real terms, and then the bars show the real change. Looking back over the last 10 years, 5 of those we were in the negative. So, of course, COVID was the one where we were in the big negative. If we look at 2022, we're still below 2019 levels. The implication of that is if we redraw the same picture and we have our lower, middle, and affluent groups, we're now in a completely different situation. Your low income is still coming down, but your high income, your affluent group is also coming down, and we're falling back into the middle. So this has massive implications from a demand perspective, right? It also impacts quite differently on different products. So here we've got, thanks to our consumer team, a whole range of products costed in terms of a serving size unit, so not rand per kilogram, but rand per typical serving size. So you've got your basic staples at the bottom, your more affordable ones, and then it ramps up quite significantly to most of your meat products at the top there. Of course, those are the ones that are expensive and a bit more sensitive to changes in spending powers, whereas your basic food staples are maybe a bit less sensitive. But then we've also got to remember who spends their money on these products. So the chart that I've just brought in, that shows the share of total expenditure on each product per income group. So if you look at maize meal, for instance, at the top, that implies that 40% of expenditure on maize is by lower income groups, and 10% is by your affluent income groups. And then, of course, when you get to the lamb at the bottom, your most expensive meat, you're looking at 60% by your affluent population and only 5% by your lower income groups. So given that picture, the one we saw before of the movements between these income groups, I think that gives you good context in terms of where the sensitivities lie in terms of market going forward. Of course, income's not the only one. There's also population size. There's things like urbanization. So the chart that you see on the left, that shows the population density in South Africa, the nice map. It also shows the change in built-up areas over the last 6 years. And then on the right-hand side, you've got population growth. So population growth over the next decade, a little bit slower than what we've seen in the past decade, but it's essentially linear, right? So, of course, we're adding a whole lot of additional people and a lot of working-age people coming in. So, of course, we need to make sure that there's opportunities for employment for these people, but this does in itself create some market for food products. So with that, I think we can have a bit more detailed look at some of the subsectors. We'll start with livestock, because it's my personal favorite, but also because it's the biggest. So let's just say it's because it's the biggest. A few key things to note. Firstly, producers have been under extreme cost pressure. I think that much is clear if you look at those price charts in the beginning. Those field crop prices that ran up so much was very nice for our field crop farmers, not so much for our livestock farmers that have to feed animals. But of course also other cost pressures, load shedding, the cost of services, etc. As I've just illustrated, your domestic consumers are under pressure. They likely will be under pressure for the next few years. That makes it all the more important to make sure that we have an export market for our surplus product, right, to ensure prices. This brings us to the animal health challenge, which we need to sort out in order to enable that. And it also implies that market access, maintenance of existing access and also expansion of market access will be critical. This illustrates that point. So it's showing basically the same thing, just for different products on the left and right. So we've got a basic profitability ratio, just output prices, so the various meats compared to maize, which is your biggest feed ingredient. And there you can see clearly, firstly, there's been a lot of volatility. This was the 2016 drought when all of them bottomed out initially. Then we had the big crop in 17, they improved. There's been a fairly consistent downhill slide since then. Some of them not quite to the 2016 levels, some of them below the 2016 levels. But I think it's clear that these industries have been under some pressure. It's also clear that as our crop prices come down, the situation does normalize over the outlook. So particularly in the second half of the outlook, we do still foresee some growth from our livestock sectors. This looks at the consumption side. If those of you that have attended most of the 20 baselines we've presented should know this chart by now. It normally looks the same. What does change every year is these percentages seem to get smaller every year, at least over the past decade. And that has as much to do with the macroeconomic situation as it has to do with us adjusting our projections. These industries, the reality is that they are strongly focused on the domestic market. Yes, there are some net exporters, there are some that are replacing imports, but the predominant biggest share of the product is going to our South African consumers, and so the economic situation here matters. Affordability also matters. The more strain our consumers are under, the more they look to affordability, and I think that's why you see, if you look at the pie chart we brought in here, it just shows the composition of the additional meat consumption projected for the coming decade. So, of course, poultry is by far the biggest one. It doesn't grow the fastest. That honor goes to pork, but poultry still accounts for about half of the additional meat that we'll consume. And, of course, this is the most affordable one as well, followed by our pork products. As I said earlier, given the situation domestically, it becomes all the more important to provide export markets for this product to move into, so that we can grow sustainably in this livestock sector. There are also success stories. I think we've said a lot about the difficult environment for our consumers, but let's just look at chicken quickly. So chicken, they signed the poultry master plan in 2019, if I'm not mistaken. This is imports. We went through a decade of rapid growth in chicken imports, 138% over the 10-year period. And since 2018, we've actually pulled back 35% of those imports. So I think that's a success story for the industry. There's been a number of factors that contributed. Avian influenza in the global situation, which stopped trade from many EU countries. There have been import tariff interventions, things like COVID, the cost of logistics, the weakening of the exchange rate. They all contributed. But I think we also have to give credit where it's due, and the competitiveness of the industry did improve over time. So this shows some work that we've done. We've done 3 cycles now. The first was 2015, then 17, and 2021, and it shows the relative cost of production in these countries, Netherlands, Germany, Poland, US, and Brazil, relative to South Africa. So basically, if it's above the line, it means it's more expensive to produce there, and if it's below the line, it means that it's cheaper to produce there. And I think if you just look at the ones, these leading exporters, look at the US, look at Brazil, in the 3 cycles that we've done, we've progressively got closer to these countries in terms of production cost. And I think the success of the soybean industry that Freddie's referred to has also contributed to that in terms of reducing the cost of feed for our domestic producers. How do we see the outlook then, given that? So here we're showing the classic outlook chart. We've got production at the back, and we've got net imports in the front, and then that profitability ratio from earlier. So I already indicated the decline that we saw. We do see some improvements going forward. Nevertheless, our growth rate over the outlook is a little bit slower than what we saw in the past decade. A lot of that has to do with the short term. So obviously we need to come out of this situation, the past few years of feed cost pressure in particular. Over the second half, that does start to look a little bit better. And I think, just to note in the short term that, the additional costs, things like the load shedding, etc., which is adding cost pressure to this industry. In the second half of the outlook, we do foresee growth improving. It's very much got to do with this profitability situation. Given where the local market finds itself, we also want to say that there was a second half of the master plan. Part of it had to do with sorting out imports. The other had to do with opening up export markets. And obviously, as we grow in production, that will become increasingly important going forward. So we have managed to stabilize imports reasonably. The share of imports in total consumption is also coming down over time, even though we get a small increase in absolute volumes. But we don't go back to the volumes that we've seen through that 2016, 18, 19 period. But we will have to start looking beyond our own market as well in future to sustain growth. The one that has done that successfully is beef. So a very similar chart than the previous one, just for a different industry. Again, showing production in the back. Of course, this has been more volatile, influenced also by the drought, slaughtering into our breeding herds through the 2016 drought in particular. Prices ran up, it was very profitable, and we've been pointing for some years to this herd expansion cycle of people rebuilding that breeding herd, which they reduced through the drought. I think that gathered some momentum in the last few years, particularly within mixed enterprises. So the ones that do field crops as well and had some good seasons in the field crop side. So we do see that coming into the market over the next few years. So there is additional supply on the way. And of course, again, we'll need to find market for that. Otherwise, there's going to be a significant price impact. Exports grew nicely initially, but that's very much stagnated, and there are reasons for that which we'll show shortly. But let's first have a look at that supply quickly. So if we just jump away from that chart, we're showing up on screen now weaner calf prices. And this is part of the reason why we say that supply is starting to come into the market. So at least if you look on the primary side, if you look at the reduction in weaner calf prices through the first half of the year, 17% for that 6-month period, that indicates that there is a supply of the primary product becoming available. We don't see that yet in slaughter numbers. So the chart on the right-hand side that shows slaughter numbers from as early as 2015-16. This, of course, was that drought period where we slaughtered into our breeding herd. But if we look at 2023 to date, we're still the lowest since that period. So we're not seeing it. And this has to do with the other side. So, of course, you've got a feedlot sitting in between. There's the supply of the calves becoming available, but the market is tight and the product's not moving. So then you get people not wanting to stock feedlots up to full potential. Of course, a lot of that has to do also with animal disease risks and so forth. The demand that we can create for this product, be it locally and or in export markets, will be critical to the level that prices find an equilibrium in the next few years. We've noted how critical exports are. Under the baseline, we go from 13% per annum in the last decade, granted most of it occurred in the early part of that decade, to only 3% per annum. Having said that, we also know that there is a comprehensive strategy that was developed flowing out of the AMP that Fody mentioned earlier, and I think you'll refer to it again in the later presentation. But there is a strategy, and they are building towards increasing that. The target is actually to get from the 6% that this implies to a 25% of production exported. And if that can be achieved, obviously will require solutions also on the animal health side. But if that can be achieved, we're looking at an entirely different picture for the beef industry than what we would necessarily be showing under the baseline here. What we have seen in exports in the last few years is actually a decline, and I've mentioned the animal health situation. What the map shows is just the change in value over the past 5 years. So looking at 2022 relative to 2018, which was, of course, when we still had a foot and mouth free zone in South Africa. The blue is a decline, and the green is an increase. So here you can see absolute volumes were a little bit down, but also there's a significant shift in terms of where product is going. So, of course, the China market is impacted by the product not being allowed to go there. Some of it was picked up in the Middle East, some of it was picked up in North America. But the reality is also that the product mix is not always the same. So it's not always simple to move it just quickly into a new market. And I think if we can broaden the access to a number of alternative markets, we certainly will have a lot more options. So this is the biggest reduction in China, some going to the Middle East. But also our neighboring countries impacted. So, looking at Angola, Namibia in particular, there was some constraints in there. And then also to say that foot and mouth, we often talk about foot and mouth because of its trade implications, but it's definitely not the only one that's causing challenges on the animal health side, right? We see that across a number of industries and for a number of diseases as well. That's what we try to show here. This is quite a striking picture to me. So it's a bit of a long-term view over time, putting foot and mouth, avian influenza and African swine fever on the same chart. Where the dot is situated gives you an idea of the number of outbreaks, and then the size of the dot is the number of animals affected. But in this case, not just animals, we did animals multiplied by carcass weight, so to give you an idea of sort of the number of product typically affected. But I think it's clear if you look at this cluster on the right here, how the situation has deteriorated in the past 3 years relative to most of the past decade. The last one then to show is pork, and that's of course one that's also influenced particularly our cross-border trade, although exports is a smaller share of this industry. I think the pork sector is a bit different to many of the other livestock ones in that whereas as beef and poultry at least had some price support in these last 2 years when feed prices ran up, pork prices didn't actually run up. They actually came under pressure because we had quite a bit of additional supply coming into the market. So this profitability ratio here went to a level that it's never been at before. That's the lowest that it's actually been. So I think there's been a lot of strain in that. We have seen some improvements on the price side, also in light of international dynamics with EU prices increasing in particular, and feed prices also coming down. But we do still foresee some cutback in the short term before growth resumes in the medium term. And then, over the outlook period, we're looking at about 2% compared to 5% per annum growth over the past decade. So that is significantly slower. And of course, productivity will be critical to achieving that sustainably. Given that pork prices declined while most other meat prices increased, that shift in relative affordability also implies that we did see a significant increase in the consumption of pork products, which I think for the industry is also positive. So that's it on the livestock side. Let's have a quick look at field crops here. I think, in some sense, some of these issues repeat themselves over the various subsectors, but then in some sense they're also different. So now we're a net exporter of most of our major field crops, the big exception being wheat, of course. But for most products, we're trading at or near export parity prices, which implies that the declining world prices will spill over quite directly into our markets. What we will say is it's been a very good past 3 years, and I'll show a chart later, but we have actually seen that many of the profits generated over the last 3 years have been invested back into these businesses. So that puts you in a good position to deal with the next down cycle in terms of efficiency and productivity. What we do need, though, is that new products which are available and are in the pipeline get registered efficiently and quickly, so that they become available to our producers to use as soon as possible. And what we also need is something that we normally measure in the horticultural context, is a look at the efficiency and the capacity of our major ports. So this is South African prices. I've mentioned already the extent to which they increase, but I think the picture is quite striking when you look at it there, as is the picture of them coming down in the next few years. They don't come down to the same extent as international prices, given that our exchange rate has weakened. And also over the outlook, there is a little bit of an offsetting there, but over the outlook, we're looking at, on average, about 2% per annum decline in the exchange rate. So it's not as big as what we've seen in the last few years. Again, there will be volatility around this. This sector is the most sensitive on the climate side, so there will be volatility around this depending on rainfall conditions. But the reality is that these are nominal prices, which are essentially flat over a 10-year period. So if you adjust that for inflation, we're looking at real prices coming down. Of course, that implies we need to get more productive if we're going to stay profitable. This is just the input side. We've talked a lot about prices going up, but it was not just output prices, it's also input prices. So this shows from 21 to 22, 36% herbicides, almost 50% increase in diesel, more than 60% increase in fertilizer. So it's not just prices that ran up, the input cost environment also did change. The good news is that we have seen those come down as well. So if we look at the first 6 months of the year, so the year to date, and compared to a relevant period in the previous year, we've seen a decline. Those are the green bars. And if we look at the projected annual average for 2023, there was also an expectation of input costs coming down. The net effect of that, Firstly, you can see the good yields and the high prices trump the input cost increases in the last few years. These are margins, they're gross margins for dryland and irrigation, a combination index for summer crops. But they do come down in 2023, and that's prices coming down, and it's also yields normalizing. So normally in the baseline, we would work with an average sort of a trend yield, so accounting for technology, but not an above or a below average year in terms of weather. Again, this will likely go up and down around this trend, depending on what weather conditions do. I said earlier that producers have reinvested. This shows two indicators. Firstly, the blue one is agricultural debt. So I think it's quite striking how that has run up over the past 3 years. What's nice is to see the complete change in that trend in the last few years. So that says that at least some of that money was, of course, the debt is for all sectors, not just for field crops, but at least some of that money went into changing that situation. But look at the machinery, tractors, machinery, and implements. So we had quite a prolonged period since 13-14 through the drought period where this was really flat. And then look at the last 3 years, how that just increased. So a lot of investment, replacing products, replacing your technology, it's obviously gains to be had from that in terms of efficiency going forward. Area-wise, this is quite an aggregate picture. So on the left, we've got total summer crop area in blue, total winter crop area in green. Winter crop sits on top here. It's actually on the right axis, so it's obviously a lot smaller than your summer crop area. But this peaked in 2022, and for the 2022-3 season, the one that will be harvested this year, or is being harvested this year, we already saw a little bit of a cutback. With prices trending down and sitting basically at export parity, we do see that consolidating again. We've been well above the norms that we saw for most of the past decade. So we are looking still at reasonably strong area, but some reduction from the current level. So there's always this 200,000 hectares that's not necessarily sustainable at I'll call it a normal export parity level, for lack of a better word, but when world prices are more normal at that export parity. What's clear is that we've had a big shift from grains into oilseeds. So this is just the composition showing the share of that total area in grains and in oilseeds. Increasing shift. This goes a little bit slower over the outlook, but maintains that trend. And I think that's a result of this consolidation that we see here happens mainly on the grain side and not so much on the oilseed side. So oilseed, we see growth slowing, but being maintained, whereas on the grain side, we actually see area contracting. And here you can see that for the individual products. So by 2032, compared to an average for the last 3 years, we've got maize area coming down 16%. Wheat and sorghum also coming down a little bit, though not so much. Barley is a little bit up. I must say that 2020 to 22 was well below average for barley. So if you look at the 2032 and you compare that to sort of the past decade, it's not actually a very strong area. It's actually a little bit down. But then look at the oilseeds. 37% still for soybeans, more than 50% still for canola, and sunflower contracting a little bit. Of course, the ones where the area's coming down, we've got nice, strong yield growth. It doesn't maybe look as impressive as some of the numbers that Ferdy mentioned earlier. It also has to do with the base period. So we have to recognize that 2020, 21, 22 were all above average years, and this is growth coming from that base. So it's very much on trend with the growth that we saw in the past. And then the oilseeds again buck that trend. So we've got for sunflower, we've got declining area. We're losing some of the marginal area, the area that struggles with things like sclerotinia, etc. And there we see a yield response. But in soybeans, we've got strong yield growth together with area, and we also see that for canola. So this is very much technology. So our technology team tells me there's a lot of new products in the pipeline that are already in the process of being registered and will become available to our producers. So we already, for things like canola and soybeans, we've already seen a step change in yields as some of that technology was released, and with more of it coming, we are quite positive with the yield prospects going forward. Ferdy, I think we can be, given that you showed that we tend to undershoot, so let's be positive with it. This is use, again, field crops. So again, we've got the grains on the left-hand side, maize being the big one, and wheat. So two things we show here. Firstly, the change again by 2032 relative to the current, to the base period. We also show the net trade position. So here you can see maize a strong net exporter, soybeans also a strong net exporter. Of course, wheat, we are a net importer and we likely will remain, and this is just to do with our natural resource potential and the area that's good for producing wheat. Demand growth, if you look at maize, we're looking at 6% in total food use and 17% feed use. This is sort of the aggregate picture by 2032. In the short term, we actually see food use being a little bit stronger and then flattening off, in relation to our consumer environment, whereas feed is the other way around. So that's a bit flat in the short term when our livestock industries are not growing that strongly, and then accelerates in the latter half when those industries' growth becomes stronger. As I said, net exporting now, of course, this is good for the competitiveness of our livestock industries, which we feed those products to. And as Fadi indicated, with ongoing replacement of imports of things like protein meal and also vegetable oil, it obviously leaves scope to crush quite significant volumes of these products going forward. So let's look at soybeans just. I won't go through all the individual products, but we like to show soybeans because it's been such a success story. Look at the rapid growth. Again, we've talked about it a lot, but look at this net trade picture. So significant surplus is being generated. And I think, for a long time we've been saying we've got surplus crush capacity, we need to expand soybean areas so that we've got enough beans to utilize that crush capacity. If you look on the right now, with that capacity relative to use, we're actually getting in a situation where we'll have to expand that capacity again quite soon. So I think there is probably opportunity to do that in the next few years. If you look at where the area has been expanding, a lot of the recent growth has come from the western parts of the country, which wasn't necessarily the case historically, which would suggest that maybe there's also opportunity then to expand the processing facilities in that part. Of course, soybeans not the only thing we're going to be exporting. This is presenting a bit of an aggregate picture of our major field crop exports. So it looks at white and yellow maize, soybeans, and also sugar. These are the four biggest ones. Look at this increase in the last few years, almost 50% from 2020 to 2023. The reality is that we are struggling a bit to move those volumes. So if you just look at prices, our maize prices traded well below export parity for most of 2023. I think that's an indication that those volumes aren't moving that efficiently through the ports. The baseline, with the cutback in area and the return to trend yields, we do see these volumes coming down a little bit, particularly for maize. The soybean volumes, of course, are strong, as you just saw. The reality is that this is normal weather. And as I said earlier, there will be some volatility around that. So what we've done is just looked at historic yield volatility and what that implied for trade. And if you put that around this average here, this is the upper bound. So if you look at where the good years are likely to be, that's above the numbers that we've seen recently. So that suggests that we really do need to look at this capacity as well in terms of expanding it. Given where these products are produced, they'll likely need to go through Durban. So this is normally the focus. I think if you look at the fruit sector and the recent investment into the container terminal to try and get improvements there, it shows, of course, that there is an urgency and a recognition that this needs to be done. So I think that's positive for the sector as a whole. The one that's less of a success story than soybeans is sugar. So this is our sugarcane area, and you can see that's been contracting fairly consistently for most of the past decade. We also expect that contraction to continue over the next few years. So it does slow a little bit, but still going downhill. That is offset by yield gains and efficiency gains. So if you look at the sugar production up at the top here, it's a different story to the decline that we see in area. Of course, we don't want to see area decline because this is an industry that's quite labor intensive and supports also a whole lot of small-scale producers. So we don't want to lose this area. But we do have fairly flat production. We also have fairly flat consumption just by nature of the product. So of course, the demand for sugar is not growing rapidly, and we also have seen a number of policy actions designed to curb that demand. So one of them is the Health Promotions Levy, which was implemented a few years ago. They are looking at increasing that level, maybe in the next few years. It wasn't done because of current distress in recent years, but that is a possibility. And then there's also things like front-of-pack labeling, etc. Some scenario work that we did here, we've got National Cane Area If we reduce local demand by 160,000 tonnes, which is not just a number that our sugar team came up with, it's based on some surveys with the major companies and what the health promotions levy would imply for formulation, that's quite a significant reduction in total area that could come if that is increased and implemented. On the right-hand side, you see the impact of that spatially. So that shows a composite risk index. It's looking at a number of factors, including which areas are good for production, which are more marginal, and shows where this area is likely to be lost. So, of course, the North Coast is the one that's at highest risk. And this is also where we find a lot of our smaller producers. So, this then becomes a question, are we going to lose many small-scale producers, or are we going to need to spend more money to support them in order to keep them in business? So last one, horticulture side. I think we've touched on some of the issues that speak to horticulture already. This is an industry that's invested massive amounts over the past decades. You saw the figure by Fadi. We've already hit the 2030 target for the NDP. Of course, that product coming into the market is also weighing on prices. So we need to make sure that those investments that we've made are sustainable so they can contribute to jobs, to foreign exchange, and all these areas that the sector contributes in. It's also, given the role of exports, infrastructure is critical to move that product. A lot of that product needs to move through our ports. It will require efforts across the value chain, not just on the producer side. So I think our producers have proven themselves resilient. A number of actions have occurred on farm, but we really need to look at the rest of the chain and make sure that that's operating efficiently to ensure sustainability. This shows those price movements. It's quite busy up top there, but we've got many industries to look at, as our horticultural team often reminds me. We've got export prices on the left, and we've got local market prices on the right. If I just put the dotted line in there, that's typical average inflation. So there you can see the green lines. That's the movement, the average annual movement through the last few years, so from 2019 through to 2022. And then the blue ones is the projection for the outlook. So you can see, especially on the export side, many of them, some negative, many of them well below inflation, and generally a little bit better over the outlook, mostly over the latter half of the outlook rather than the first half. But this is, of course, it combines a number of factors. So it's additional product coming into the market, it's products struggling to move through the ports, etc., that all influences that. The implication of it in terms of profitability, we just show here for potatoes, which is, of course, quite an input-intensive industry. We've simplified it significantly, so this is just the potato price compared to fertilizer prices. That's not saying fertilizer is the only input used on the potato side, but it is, of course, a major one. So it just gives us some idea. And here you can see the fact that prices didn't increase through that period where input prices increased sharply, the effect that has on profitability. So we are seeing some normalization now with less supply in the market. And if we look longer term, if we can just summarize the potato market outlook in one chart here, very flat area, so less than 0.5% per annum growth in area over the 10-year period. Most of the production growth, so we're looking at 1.5% per year in terms of production, most of that coming from yield gains over that decade, and of course most of it being consumed in South Africa, given the nature of that product. Our fruits then are much more export orientated. So here again we've got nice aggregate view. Look at this area expansion over the past decade, so that's huge growth, and then look at the outlook, so just 3% over that 10-year period, so very flat in terms of area, some contraction in the short term and then stabilization, but the volumes still increase all the way. So that's firstly that's your normal yield gains in terms of efficiency, in terms of technology, but it also has to do just with the age of your orchards, right? So here we've plotted the main products, looking just at full bearing equivalent area and area that's not yet bearing. So look at these big ones here, soft citrus, lemons, soft citrus more than 40% not yet bearing, lemons 30%, 50% of avocados not yet bearing, 63% of macadamias not yet bearing. So this is trees that are in the ground, but they're not yet actively contributing to production. So this suggests that there's the volume picture that you saw in the previous one. That's where these volumes are coming from. So there's significant volume coming into the market. And again, I've said it before, we need to find a market so that we can ensure that it moves at sustainable prices. The map, if it looks complicated, it is because it is complicated. This is what happens when our horticulture team tells our data science team, I've had an idea, and they say, challenge accepted. So we've got basically the whole value chain on the map here. The pie charts show production, so that's the major products being produced in the various regions. So of course you can see the Western Cape, which is big on fruit. Then we've got the orange in the back is population density, so that's where our local markets are. We've got our local fresh produce markets also operating on here. The trucks are sitting at border posts there, so land border posts, and then the ships, obviously in our major ports where these products need to move through. The long and the short, if you look at this picture, the table on the right-hand side there, we have seen massive growth in exports, and we're still looking at about 26% over the coming decade. This value also seems to get smaller every year. That's not because there's less, it's just because the stuff is actually starting to come in, so the base increases. But that's still significant growth in volumes. We're already struggling to move volumes, so that's significant growth coming. Yeah, I think maybe just to point out on a positive note, the investment that we've seen from private equity into Durban's container terminal. I think there's quite a lot of hope in the industry that this will have an influence on the efficiency of that port in particular, replacing some older machinery and getting the product to move through there a bit more efficiently. I've said that we're already struggling. This is the units moving through our ports in 2018-19, so it's sort of pre-COVID, pre-the war, pre-all the challenges that we've seen in the last few years. It really just gives us a bit of a benchmark. Then we had COVID, particularly this early period when we had the hard lockdown. You can see the impact that had on volumes. Then we had a period of reasonable recovery where we actually improved quite a bit. So this is the average for 21-22. There was still issues. If you look at this one here, that was in October 22. We had the Transnet strike, which pulls this one down quite significantly. But then we've also got weather conditions that often influences our ports, particularly in the Western Cape, and also the management issues around that, which also makes a difference. If we look at 2023, relative to all these other lines that we've got in the back there, firstly, striking that it's a lot more volatile, so a lot more up and down over time. But also total volume for the year to date is well below what we saw in 21-22. So apart from the COVID year, very low compared to the previous, the last few years. So that's obviously not a good picture to see if you're an exporter needing to move product through these ports. This is the World Bank index that looks at the efficiency of our ports. I think we've noted before that we come down in quite low there. We're hoping that will improve as we get investment into these ports. But of course, it's your most perishable products that are most sensitive, right? So when there's delays in ports, these are the ones that feel the brunt of it. So just looking at blueberries and stone fruit here, significant growth expected over the coming decade. A lot of that growth needing to go into export markets. So obviously for these industries, it's really critical to get these ports moving. It speaks to the quality of the product. If it's stuck there, you lose quality. It's entering the market at the wrong time. We have markets that are short and then flooded, and it's all sort of into a negative spiral as it influences the profitability of our producers. This is the same as what we had for the other ones, except for the million products on the x-axis here, again showing growth. So looking at 2032 relative to an average for the last 3 years, you can see again this growth in production. It also splits it by marketing channel. So there you can see that the bulk of this additional product will go into the export market, which of course means again that it needs to move through our ports. So I can't overemphasize this enough, that needs to work efficiently for this to be sustainable. But it also implies that markets are critical. So we haven't forgotten about markets. And I think that has two aspects. The one is retaining the markets we have. Looking at something like AGOA, we have huge volumes of product going to the US currently, so that's around 9 billion going to the US, mainly macadamia nuts, oranges, wine, mandarins. So that's obviously, that's one aspect of it, but we need to look at the competitiveness of our current markets, and then of course also expanding market access so that we don't flood the current markets that we have with the new volumes coming into production. This just considers the contribution of these industries. So we've got two, we've got citrus and we've got wine, both of which are fairly stable in terms of area over the coming decades, so little change in area, but not little change in contribution. So if we just look at the value of production, look at the value of exports with these additional volumes coming, so almost 70% additional exports. In citrus, it's the case of volumes. In wine, it's the case of price, so it's looking to add more value, moving to lower volumes, moving to higher price products. Local sales also increasing 90%, 120%. This is again depicted in terms of value, not in terms of volume. So for something like wine, for instance, that's a fairly constant volume, but it's moving at a higher value thanks to a real increase in prices. If you look at jobs and dependence, that's not shooting out the lights in terms of increases, but you know, we're looking at 750,000 people in citrus and 1.3 million in wine that's being sustained in these industries. So I think that in itself is an achievement already. Citrus we've showed for some years. It's also the biggest one, so it tends to be the example that we use. It's not the only one that's struggling, but it is certainly, if you look at the baseline, prices have been coming down for quite a few years now. We see prices maybe bottoming out in the next year or two, but this is just the risk profile. So this is our farm level team doing some risk analyses, so multiple runs, changing key variables and looking where that comes out. The red is a negative earnings before interest and tax. The orange is a positive one, but not sufficiently positive to cover things like debt and interest. So yellow and green, this is really where we need to be. And there you can see, particularly in the next few years, those risks are still quite high. So we looked at options to mitigate that, very much focused on farm. So this is looking at the role of exports, so increasing the share of exports in your total market, moving to a higher quality product, so getting more exports into this class 1 category, and also looking at the size and the counts and getting that right and matching that up with what your markets really need. If we can get that right, it needs additional costs at producer level, so there's obviously production practices that need to be done to achieve that, and that implies that there will be an additional cost. It also implies that we can unlock more value, so we can change that picture quite significantly. If you look at the red and orange on the right here compared to the baseline one, if we can get a few things right, there is a difference to be made, and that's around a 40,000 rand per hectare improvement in 2024, if we can manage that. Of course, there's also other things that influence the sector. This again looks at on-farm, so it's showing the same measure, but this is for a palm fruit farm in the Western Cape. The baseline, as you see, it doesn't start from a particularly favorable position, obviously because the sector is facing a number of challenges. There's been adverse weather, drought, hail, things like that. Of course, the infrastructural issues that we've mentioned, and then also things like load shedding, the ability to irrigate, and so forth. These are actions that need to be taken post-farm gate, right? So things to solve things like load shedding, that's not necessarily, you can invest in alternative systems, but the producer can't solve that himself. But it influences them. So look at this picture in under the baseline, which is, if I need to relate it to load shedding in particular, it's sort of the situation that we're in currently. So maybe level 2, level 3. The scenario here is one of consistent level 5, level 6 load shedding in the short term. So you can see the impact that makes. In the longer term, yes, per hectare, we do get back to reasonably the same level. So this assumes that we solve this problem over the next 3 years based on the current investment that we're getting into the energy sector. But there will be much fewer hectares. That's part of why we see this normalization. And that's also a response given the shortages, you know, the ability to irrigate and things like that with load shedding that's reducing the total area. So on a per hectare basis, we do get back to a similar number, but in total, the value being generated by this industry is significantly smaller. That's it. I think we did just go a little bit over, but we made the bulk of it in time. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Tracy, Freddie, and Julian. Let's give them another round of applause because they really entertained us. Tracy did indicate that because there are so many questions and difficult questions, but we also have the entire BFAP team here. They are also responsible for taking some of the questions. So we'll skip the Q&A for now, and during the break, we will have the team engaging in the networking and answering some of the questions. So we will move to a break now. Let's take half an hour break, and we'll be back seated around 10 after 4. And those online, you can also get a chance to stretch your legs, watch some videos from BFAP, and let's meet in about half an hour. Thank you. 2023, which is also our 20th. And there are not many introductions or many things to say, just to say we have 3 more presentations to listen to, and then we'll be moving towards wrapping up. And without any waste of time, I'm going to call upon Ferdy to come and explain how the baseline is used, and we'll move on from there. Ferdy?
Thanks very much, Matlo. Colleagues, friends, decisive actions to forge a sustainable future. That's our topic for today. And what we want to do in this next session is go beyond just your baseline projections. We've seen what Julian has done, presented in terms of global outlook. Tracy has done the local sector. The rest of it's all in the menu. You can read it in your books or contact us for more detail. So what I'm doing in this next session is just with a few slides give you some of the applications. And this really comes through collaboration with great partners who are also sitting here in the room. Our APSA, Western Cape Department of Agriculture, who've been with us with the baseline for all the 20 years, and also producer organizations and companies who have invested in these analytics that you're seeing today. So there's also a big thank you to all of you who are in the room here and also online. So the question is, how can we bend this curve? So Tracy's mapped out, I think if you just kind of, if you can summarize it, what are the key drivers under grains and oil seeds? What are the key drivers under livestock? What are the key drivers under horticulture? And I'm sure all of you, you're also sitting in these debates and the negotiations, and you read a lot on international publications or online social media. And the question is really, how do we change this curve? How do we capture these opportunities and bend, essentially, create this red line, which we have done in the past. And I think that was just linking it to the introduction that I briefly did. Before we get to some of the tangible, practical examples, we have to show this slide again. And for those of you who sat in many, many hours of the master plan, you know the slide very well. We refer to these. Yeah, don't start crying. It's okay, but we have to show it again. So these are the preconditions for inclusive growth. And we believe that that's one of the key differences between the National Development Plan and the Master Plan. Is the Master Plan is much more specific. And yes, we are planning, we have a planning maybe over focus on planning in South Africa and less focus on implementation. And this is where a big part of our challenge lies. But that doesn't mean that we need to stop talking about it, pointing it out, and also showing what would happen if we don't do it. In other words, this cost-benefit analysis. Sitting together around a table and saying, if we don't get this right, these are the implications, or on the positive note, if we do get it right, what are the opportunities? So just in broad terms, and then I'll shift to some very tangible examples. On the investment side, and you don't have to read through all of this detail, this is not a great presentation slide, but essentially on the investment side is security of land ownership and 10-year security models. It's the secure water rights, it's safety and security at farm level. These are greater cross-cutting interventions and reforms that are required. We see that, we talk about it a lot. And what we did in the master plan is to a large extent, what we could quantify and simulate the impact. That's what we've done. So some of those simulations are in there. I don't know if maybe 2% or 3% of the audience has actually gone through all the material of the master plan, because there's a lot. Lot of material, and that's maybe something that we need to work on is, again, the communication of these plans, of the strategies, and also to all the industry leaders out there. You're doing a great job, but keep on doing that job and spread the news of this more detailed plan. So investments are important. Your support and innovation is important. And with this specifically, access to finance. Your green box direct support measures. Julian gave us a great slide, just giving a glimpse of type of support measures that can be in place for agriculture. We are bringing a lot new emerging farmers, new entrant farmers into the game. Under these competitive global conditions, it's tough. It's tough even for existing commercial guys to do it. So we need to consider these very specific support measures. Effective extension services, your targeted R&Ds, your universities, your ARC, these are all important institutions. They all play a great role in it. So I'm not going to your support and innovation, your infrastructure, and your markets. So this is almost like, guys, we've talked about this, and we can talk about it a lot of times. It's how can we do some tangible cost-benefit impact analysis to understand where do we need to go first. So in other words, to prioritize reforms in order to get the biggest impact. And that's currently where to a large extent, where the country is that the challenges that we're facing currently, we'll have to prioritize. And this is also part of the negotiation, isn't it? There are priorities that we need to figure out. And in each industry, there are priorities that we need to focus on. The first one that we wanted to just to highlight to you is how does this master plan, just a basic example of the livestock industry. Now, the people who have followed us with baseline presentations and the master plan negotiations, you know that we refer to the sleeping giant in South Africa is the livestock industry, with huge potential specifically around inclusive transformation, additional growth that we have, and the overlay, and that's what these spatial maps are showing us, is look at poverty incidences and where the ownership of livestock lies. So we have a big share of our population having access or actually farming with smaller units, having access to livestock, whether these are sheep, cattle farms, beef. There's a big opportunity, a big overlay. It cannot only be the industry that can drive it itself. It needs partnerships, but it has a huge potential. Like Tracy was talking about it, it is our largest industry and has the biggest potential for growth. Your overall animal health, your whole system that needs to be in place, your state, your veterinary services, your extension services, your biosecurity, it's a complex system. And this is, forget about the detail. For those of you who've just been in the livestock or in the master plan negotiations, that's what reference group 2 was talking about. All these pillars, and in each pillar there are very specific interventions that have been debated, have been analyzed, and they are market-led interventions that can work. But we need to work together on it. And the principles around growing a bigger market, Tracy's talked about that export market. How do we unlock an export market to create this demand pull, to create this drive in the industry where there's actually market space for everyone to foster? And we have a clear example of this already in the red meat industry strategy, and that is essentially aligned with the master plan. So you already have industry taking action, aligning to the master plan, saying, let's drive whatever we can drive, but we can't do it on our own. So that's just a principle application where we can change bend the curve with very specific interaction. But it requires partnerships in this process, and it will take time. We won't solve it in a short run, especially not your livestock situation that we currently have in the country. The second opportunity for a lot more alignment, partnerships, and growth. Or maybe let me just take a step back. In the National Development Plan, there were 3 big areas that we identified for opportunities. And that's where we created the growth and the jobs. Those 3 areas were the high-value export industries, agro-processing, and your inclusive, your smallholder farming sector where there are big productivity gains. And to a large extent, this IAT initiative, Inclusive Agriculture Transformation, that we launched a number of years ago, or we started working on these systems to align, to measure, to standardize a lot of the monitoring and evaluation of these transformation projects, and to start putting data together and to align the data and to start, do we measure in the same way? What do we regard as success? What are the successful transformation projects that we can learn from? And what these dots are essentially showing us, there are many institutions doing great work, and they're great databases. Where we see a role is taking that data and starting to align in order to the analytics, to do the shocks, to do the foresighting, to do the insight around that. What can we learn out of it? How can we make these industries sustainable, profitable into the future? And this is, as I've mentioned, a roadmap. There have been many institutions since 2014 where we've developed specific technology databases and started learning a lot from this. And as I said, this is a process that we all need to work on together, and that we're learning together as we're going forward. There's not one single answer to it, but certainly there's a big demand, a big need for alignment in this space where we start to measure it accurately, because this is one of our biggest challenges that we have in the sector. Do we measure in the right way? Do we target our reforms? Are there opportunities where we can fast-track a lot of these reforms? So these are some of the M&E examples. And then obviously running, this is just from our platform, our systemized approach, where you typically have a grower database, and our clients, some of you in the audience are well aware with some of this, where you have spatialized or georeferenced grower database, but then furthermore you can create this insight into the data and also the foresight. In other words, starting to do the shock analysis, seeing in which direction is this going, stress testing, and understanding which targeted reforms could actually have the biggest impact on the sustainability of the sector. Third example is around energy. And this is obviously the big question currently. If we just look at electricity use to value added ratio, in other words, how much value add, or how much does agriculture and agro-processing add per unit of electricity used? Agriculture and agro-processing are the highest sectors. Okay? These are the costs that currently what agriculture is paying for electricity. So we all know the story. Recently we did work for the Western Cape Department Agriculture, where we started zooming in and understanding, firstly, we are the big energy users in terms of irrigation, in terms of agro-processing. Which type of energy, what are the solutions, what are the costs, and now starting to work on what are the alternatives. So this is just a spatial map with targeted irrigation areas where we could specify hectares, type of irrigation, and obviously this is dependent on a lot of the flyover data that's available for the Western Cape, where we can overlay specific fields and crops, but a lot of strategic insight into the alternatives. And what are those alternatives? What do they cost? So again, getting the strategic cost benefit, shaping it, targeting it, finding solutions which are sustainable. And then just a kind of a high-level view, looking at, we also understand which period of time, which municipality has the biggest demand. So this is in the winter time, it's green. Obviously, we understand here in the summertime, that's where most of the electricity is required. You can do it spatially, you can do it per crop. Again, it's a very much more targeted, tangible approach to inform these decisions or investments. What happens if we don't have action? And that's also something that we need to talk about. So what we did in this heat map here is just looking at the different industries and understanding at which load shedding level what will happen with these industries in terms of severity of impact. So again, creating this insight, and for all of this, we start with a baseline, and then you start to build on it. You introduce the shocks, and you start to specify where what happens. Energy, the question is, I'm sorry, the title there is cut off a little bit, and the reading should be Shifting Energy Crisis, thank you, into an Opportunity. So additional market developments required, and we looked at it. Tracy talked about sluggish economic growth. We need to open up export markets. But could an energy market potentially start to play a role for agriculture? And again, this is work that we're currently doing, currently exploring with various partners. And just looking at cultivated land, so cash crop area nearly halved from its peak of about 8 million hectares. Now this is cash crop, just the major crops. From about 8 million hectares, it nearly halved. That was the peak in 1985 to 86. And these are purely market-driven realities. So area that you just, and to a large extent where we've seen climatic shifts, and basically marginal areas just not being in production. The question is, can we see some of that production could be coming back under an energy model? And what could those energy models look like? So, and the reality is, in terms of this was just an example of South African gas supply, there are serious implications for reducing the amount of gas that's available, for example, out of Mozambique, out of those resources. So there will clearly have to be some form of alternative use or supply of these energy sources. And the question is, could agriculture play a role? We have seen much of the food versus fuel debate. So again, it's being very careful and analytic and understanding. And this is where some of the hindsight really becomes very practical. So just look at this 2005 line there. 2005 was a big period, Julian was referring to it, where the biofuel industries kicked in and it changed the relationship. These are maize prices and energy prices. Look at those Brent crude oil prices and maize prices since then. So essentially, and we had these big food versus fuel debates, you'll all recall that we can learn from that experience. So there's a much bigger interaction between energy and food, or energy and maize in this case. So obviously learning from these experiences and saying, but do we have opportunities in South Africa? Are there alternatives for marginal areas that could come under production with alternative crops? And what would be the support that's required or the policy reform that's required to get those areas under production? So essentially, this was just an example of silage sorghum, much more hardy crop, and just looking at gross margins and comparing that under current conditions to some grain crops. And obviously, those grain crops are, if you compare it in marginal areas or fallow areas where you have opportunity, and then our value chain team working in this, the whole process, in other words, the logistics and the realities around actually getting towards energy, right from the farm all the way through to energy, exploring options. Again, early days, but alternatives that we need to look at and kind of revisit. And these are not the old debates that we had in 2005 around maize from ethanol. These are far more advanced technologies and also debates, but getting back to the principles, learnings from the policies that we've seen in the past. And it also speaks to just examples around potential land in the Eastern Cape, where we have commercial farms. These are smallholder farms and a lot of potential for further development where we have a lot of fallow or underutilized or unproductive land that we could potentially unlock. Again, opportunities that can be developed. These are some of the alternatives in South Africa. Since our first, let's say 2012, BFAP has done considerable amount of work also in Africa. So we are not a think tank only in South Africa, but also in Africa, and we are very proud members of the RENAPRI, the Regional Network of Agricultural Policy Research Institutes. And a lot of this work that we're doing is basically grounded in learnings and in supply chains, in markets that the skills and the databases and methodology that we've developed in South Africa. And it's a great privilege that we can work with our colleagues. So showing these examples to you now for South Africa, we want to switch and first give Holger the opportunity to talk a bit more about the broader context of Africa, because I think for all of us in this room, Africa is a major market. There are opportunities, but also colleagues working together as a continent and unlocking the potential for this continent. So Holger is going to talk about those giving a broader context on Africa from the FAO side. And then Matlo will come in and give you some practical examples of work that we've done there. Again, highlighting just some of the key outcomes and drives that we see in the African market and the work that we've done there. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Ferdy, for the introduction and the opportunity to share some of our outlook work with you today. And please excuse my voice here. So as you heard from Julian, the weather was horrible in Europe in recent weeks. So yes, as Ferdy said, I would like to talk about where we see global and African agriculture in the next decade and how these relate to the Sustainable Development Goals. So the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development was adopted by all UN nation member states in 2015. It's a universal call to action and provides a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity for people and the planet. Out of the 17 goals, agriculture contributes most of all to SDG 2, to end hunger, achieve food security, and improve nutrition and promote sustainable agriculture. But the sector also has to consider SDG 13, take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. The key challenge is, of course, to overcome the apparent trade-offs between more production and fewer emissions. There are immense challenges to achieve these targets. So, assuming on-trend technology, consumer preferences and policies, and using current macroeconomic expectations, our outlook projections suggest that without additional efforts, zero hunger will not be achievable by 2030, and agriculture greenhouse gas emissions will increase further. Here you see two indicators to illustrate the challenges: undernourishment and the emissions intensity. So, globally, there were about 716 million people undernourished in 2022, 210 million of them in sub-Saharan Africa. The baseline projections shown, shown up here, right, indicate that globally we're on the right track. No, it's going slightly down, and that's mostly on the account of Asia here. But we're way too slow. And so there's still about 600 million undernourished here in 2030 and about 215 million of them in sub-Saharan Africa. So the line here is slightly increasing. So globally on the right track, but overall way too slow, and in sub-Saharan Africa even going the wrong way. Now, regarding the emissions target, a Tier 1 assessment, which assumes constant emission factors, projects that we have overall a decrease in the emission intensity in all regions. But still, we have an overall increase in total emissions over the coming decade. And showing this for sub-Saharan Africa, the Near East, North Africa, Latin America, here you have production growth and emissions growth. And you see the intensity is going down for all regions. So production outgrows emissions, but sub-Saharan Africa here still has quite a high level, so the highest of all the major regions, and as it accounts for about 17% of the emissions, but only 7% of production in 2031. Now, I also would like to point out that these assumptions are subject to uncertainty, of course. This example shows the sensitivity to fertilizer prices, which have been a concern, in recent years. So what we did here, we increased the price of fertilizer in our model by 25% in 2032, and we simulated that about 30% of that will be passed through to agricultural prices, and the chart here shows the various price increases of the crops in the region of sub-Saharan Africa. So on average, it's here about 7%, so about 30% being passed through. So that increase would squeeze farmers' margins and reduce food consumption, and as a result of that, undernourishment would also increase, and we estimated about 3.5 million people increase in 2032. Now, so under the baseline assumptions, we're obviously way off track for the SDGs. So I now would like to discuss a scenario that we simulated where we would eliminate hunger and put the sector on track of the 2015 Paris Agreement in 2030, using only agricultural productivity as the instrument to overcome the trade-offs. So in this scenario, we define zero hunger as a prevalence of undernourishment below 2.5%, and the emissions target is a reduction of 6% of direct emissions compared to global levels. Now, looking at the nutrition side first, showing again Sub-Saharan Africa and other developing regions for reference. So on the very left here, you see the baseline assumption for 2030. So that means that's the baseline. So, and this is about an 8% growth. So this is the normal baseline assumption. But if you want to have zero hunger, you need to go here. So 25% above this one. So significantly higher and the highest required growth of all regions. So you see there, fewer increases required here. And so just to explain that a little bit, so for simplicity, we assumed that this food will be affordable to all, and the calorie distribution within a country, which tends to be very uneven in Africa, would remain the same as it is in the baseline. But we assume that a growing share of more nutritious food, especially from animal sources, will come in, which also means more feed. That's important then for the production side. And we also assumed that consumption in food-secure countries, which has a lot of excess consumption, will also remain the same. Now, looking at the production response to that, again, the same sort of setup here. You have the current, then the base, and then the zero hunger scenario. And you see there, the baseline foresees about 11% production growth. Globally, so this is Sub-Saharan Africa, but globally, about 11% growth and 61% to achieve the zero hunger. So, and based on our assumptions, we assume that most of the growth would come in the countries where the increase in consumption would be located, so low and middle income countries. And this is then reflected here in the chart that for Sub-Saharan Africa, the baseline increase here is about 19%, but it would have to double to achieve zero hunger, right? That clear? So, so this is target one, providing enough food to eliminate hunger. But remember, even under baseline conditions, emissions would increase already. So imagine where they would go if we have that type of production. And the objective, as I said, of the scenario is to find out what level of productivity would it take to get them actually down. And that's a summary for the global level now here. So before we go again to the regions. So that shows that globally we need a 28% increase over the current levels by 2030. And specifically about a 24% increase in yields. And for reference, in the last decade, they grew about 13%. And the global animal productivity, which is the main source of emissions from agriculture, the livestock sector would increase by 31%. And in the last decade, it hardly increased its productivity at all. Now, looking again at the levels that we would envisage for Sub-Saharan Africa under baseline and the scenario. Under baseline assumptions, yield grow between 10 and 20% to 2030 from mostly low levels. This still means some closing of the gap with more productive regions. Also, fertilizer use is projected to increase, but as we also heard before, efforts are constrained by limited use of inputs, irrigation infrastructure. But achieving the SDGs would mean to increase yields by about 25 to 90%, which is necessary to enable the decoupling of crop production growth and land use change, right? So strong improvements are especially required here in wheat, rice, and pulses, which are food crops that are consumed, especially as you get to higher level, and they're heavily dependent on imports in the region. So, because as I said, we wanted to assume a predominantly domestic production response. Now looking at the livestock side of things, again, in the baseline, the livestock production sub-Saharan Africa is expected to increase by 27% over the decade based on herd expansions and productivity improvements, and that's shown here. So you have production and you have herd improvement. So and the difference is the productivity improvement. So in the baseline, there's everywhere some productivity improvement, but also everywhere some herd improvement. So, but compared to that, meat production would have to double, and milk production needs to increase by 145% in the zero hunger. So, right? So, it would mean 100% doubling here to fulfill the livestock demand. But as I said, it's a key source of emissions. So, to get the emissions down, you have to drastically reduce the herd. So, that level of production will have to be achieved with fewer animals, as you see in that level, in that yellow bar here. So just to get that down. So it would be a tremendous transformation that be required. Now a quick look at trade. So under the baseline assumptions here, sub-Saharan Africa is expected to rely progressively on imports to supplement basic food production. So it's estimated an increase here about 77%, but then for the zero hunger, as I said, we shifted a lot of that back into regional production rather than relying a lot on imports here. So let me just sum this up. So over the decade, agriculture and fish production in sub-Saharan Africa is projected to expand by 24%. That's the fastest of all major regions, but still the value of production per capita is expected to decline further. Total calorie availability per capita for food is lowest in the world, and stubbornly high inflation and a slow recovery in income levels implies that gains will be slow. As just seen, region trade deficit is expected to deepen. And regarding the scenario, we would clearly say that it requires really a comprehensive global effort and transformation that involves reduce of poverty, increase of agriculture productivity, as we just shown, but also additional measures, right? So like to mitigate agricultural greenhouse gas emissions directly through technology, equalize food consumption within countries, so work on the distribution, limit the excess calorie and protein intake in higher income countries, and reduce food loss and waste. So clearly, if the scenario showed anything, it's that technology alone will not be sufficient, and we need to face these often uncomfortable debates about, eating less, eating differently, wasting less, and producing differently. And yeah, and from an FAO point of view, our role is to support this debate and transformation, and we're looking forward to working with all of us, with you. Sorry, and that's it. Sorry, boy.
Thank you, Julian. Holger. Okay, yes. Thanks, Holger. And I come here to present in the last session, I think that's one way of BFAP shifting the accountability. Should we run over time, then as the program director, you'll have to account how did that happen. But you are one of the people who was on stage beyond time. So my time is really limited here. So, but Freddie introduced a little bit of my presentation by indicating that part of what BFAP is doing or has been doing on the continent and linking to the work overall is to illustrate some of the examples and cases where we have applied our analytical tools. But it is also about the footprint that BFAP has on the continent that we've been building, over 20 years, but the last 10, 12 years, we participated in the formation of RENAPRI, Freddie mentioned that, which is a regional network of agricultural policy institutes. And we collaborate, we work together, and some of the work that I will be sharing relates to that. First, the analytical tools that are used to link up primarily with some of the outcomes and the challenges through SDGs, but also through other policy programs within the countries and on the continent, how these applications can support and assist in decision-making as well as implementation. In doing so, I will also show the cases of horticulture where we worked in Malawi as well as the Kenya feed industry. But just going back to the African footprint, you can see the number of countries that BFAP has a footprint, is working or has worked and continue to work out there. And we developed this set of toolkits with IFPRI as well as our partners on the continent, the RENAPRI. But these tools, which we refer to as policy and investment prioritization for value chain analysis, or from now on, I'm just going to refer to it as PPVC. It's a combination of models and analytics to basically support government in decision-making, but as well as investment implementation. The rationale behind the development and the combination of this set of tools is primarily on the basis that you tend to have a situation where there are a lot of recommendations in as far as government needs to do. Freddie mentioned that as well, that in South Africa we have all these studies, we have all these plans. However, it is the next phase where you tend to struggle to find the output, the impact, or even the implementation. But the second point is due to the fact that generally these plans, they focus on agriculture, leaving behind the food system, leaving behind what happens after the farm gate. And that is key part of the development and moving forward. And it also addresses or bring in the private sector to work in government, with government, but also a realization that the resources are not abundant. The government does not have all the required resources to implement all what they need to. Hence, the need to prioritize certain value chains or certain actions. It is about the people, the PPVC approaches. It is also about the environment or the resources plus the economy. So the process is a stepwise process where we look into the available resources and the potential to produce, using that and then applying the partial equilibrium or the economic model to see the feasibility and the application thereof to determine the current state. In other words, with the resources that you have in the current market, what is it that the value chain or a set of value chains are able to produce? But more often, and also part of the work that we do, is, are you happy with the current state? If I offer you the same state 10 years into the future, would you take it? Or would you rather have a better future? And more often, we want to have a better future than today. And the next question is now, how or what needs to be done to change this path into a better future, to have a different state in future, but most importantly, to act on it in order to see the economic feasibility and implications, and finally, the economy-wide impacts through the economy, throughout the value chain, as well as the livelihoods in general. As a set of tools, it also is replicable. It is also teachable, which is what BFAP and the RENAPRI partners, as well as IFPRI, we continue to train on these models, but we put together all these value chains, take them through all these steps, taking into account the economic policies that are currently under implementation. We look at those value chains in terms of performance, and we get to a state where we need to go into deeper into understanding the analysis, the pathways, the resources and information that is not necessarily easily available to evaluate all the value chains across 5 main indicators, which would be the market. Can you produce this? Can you produce this competitively? Can you compete against the international or regional players? But then Holger talked about the socio-economic inclusiveness that are being pursued through SDGs. So there are indicators in this policy toolkit where we are able to see the contribution towards those social indicators, including employment and as well as poverty reduction. But then the agricultural transformation has also a set of indicators which enables to see whether the food systems will contribute to the growth, as well as the dietary changes or improvements thereof. And then finally, which of the value chains will be sensitive to some of the climatic indicators. Putting all this together and subjecting it to all the tests as well as verification, we end up with a value chain ranking across the 5 indicators, but we develop or we determine an overall rank which would basically indicate which ones are performing better overall. However, it needs to be emphasized that it is unlikely, if not impossible, to have a value chain that is performing consistently better across all the indicators, and vice versa is unlikely to see the one that is poor on all 5. And with just that, it gives the opportunity to pick the best, to allocate the resources to the select few and focus effort and attention into that so that it can drive this inclusive transformation in the agricultural sector. Now, the inclusive agricultural transformation actually varies depending on the nature of the economy. But for the developing countries, if you look at the sub-Saharan African countries on that figure, you'll see on the left you've got high bars for African countries and low bars for the developed countries, which indicates that agriculture as well as the food systems, they contribute a lot more in those developing countries, and the impacts and the shocks, they will do the same thing when they happen. But the transformation that we seek into is to bring in the other players along the value chain, the traders all the way up until the final market. But what IAT is or does is that it shifts, it transforms the producers from subsistence to another level where they are actually participants and they specialize. It enables some of them to move into high-value commodities or high-value products that are contributing more in terms of income and not necessarily in terms of food self-sufficiency. Changing the structure of the system as well as participation by all the players involved. What it requires, and Fedi mentioned this, is that it also requires effort and action, particularly in this era where we are taking complex actions because the environments are different. We started by basically mentioning the challenges of all these kind of shocks that happens and changes the projection and the way we look forward. Decision making under such circumstances actually tends to be just as complex. And the point about that is that this action is required to change the path that we do not necessarily desire going forward. Julian's also indicated that, not Julian, Holger. Holger did show that. Actually, sub-Saharan Africa is a net importer of food. This picture doesn't change. It is also in the long term. But you'll see that in the latter few years, it is also worsening. And when you look at the right box, you see the consumption as well, consumption per capita of some of the selected Eastern and Southern African countries is that going forward, the consumption is going to increase, so is the production. So the staple production would continue for a while on the other hand, we are importing highly processed, highly perishable, as well as high-value products. And in value terms, I think that's just the definition of what a net importer of a product is, or in this case, of food. Now, looking into or getting into the two case studies that I mentioned before, we'll look at where these PPVC methodologies we have applied in Malawi and Kenya. And the case of Malawi, where the mango value chain, again, horticultural products, high value relative to the staples, has an opportunity to contribute towards the national policy goals, but at the same time increasing jobs, production, productivity, as well as the incomes that are earned. Just briefly getting into Malawi is that as a small landlocked country, it has land pressure. The land access per capita is going, it's getting smaller and smaller over time. But the reliance on agriculture is much more, with 1/5 of the GDP contributed by the agricultural sector, and mainly maize, a staple product. Government realized that, and there's a need to shift that with the Malawi 2063, a long-term strategic vision, which seeks to industrialize, or using pillars of industrialization, commercialization, as well as urbanization, to change that path or to have a better future than they are faced with if they do nothing, if they don't follow through. And for urbanization, the mango value chain provides that opportunity through secondary cities, where the linkages between the rural producers of mangoes and the large processors or the processing facilities that enable access to international markets, as well as inclusion of the producers to enter into the market and to sell to those international players, can be improved. In other words, basically upgrading the mango value chain from what is known generally as traditional. Traditional meaning that it is short, it involves few players, in other words, producers who, as I said, usually rural dwellers, are small in nature, and you have few traders coming in, buying from them and going to the market. That's kind of what we mean in terms of a short value chain. However, what that does is that per ton of any ton increase out of the traditional value chain, you have a very small contribution relative to upgrading it to a modern one, which has opportunities to include other players, other services such as insurance, such as finances, transportation. However, that also needs some intervention to link up with the producers. But in a nutshell, a modern value chain has an opportunity to add $460 per ton that is produced. But most importantly is that the distribution of the earnings as well as the wages is much more towards the rural people, the rural producers, as well as those that are happening in between in order to link up the markets. The three key interventions that could actually help to move and realize some of these outcomes are that, one, you would need a market access. As I mentioned, the challenges of a landlocked country is that the movement of perishable products is quite limited and dependent upon a third country. But generally, the opportunities are in the Northern Hemisphere due to counter-seasonalities, and Malawi has a lot of advantage to that. The disadvantage is that currently the tariffs and the non-tariff measures are very high and they would need to be opened up. There would be a need to establish medium to large facilities or players who can interlink with the smallholders in the rural areas, but also to upgrade, to increase productivity. The extension service would need to support the production, the caring, the treatment of the trees in order to increase that. And with that, you see improvement in the volumes of production, improvement in the value add to the economy, as well as jobs for those rural areas. So that's just an illustration of how the PPVC methodology, obviously working with the government, but most importantly, following up on the action, it can assist or can lead to this upgrading of value chain and some contribution towards the SDGs. The second case is the case of Kenya feed industry. Basically, to summarize that, we all are aware of the challenges of the genetic modified, particularly on maize, that most countries, particularly on the continent, they actually do not allow those in human food. And as a result, it has a number of restrictions. So the way to unlock, or the way in which Kenya can unlock some of the opportunities, is by allowing, and this discussion is already going on, allowing GM yellow maize into the feed industry, not into humans, because then the sensitivity there is much less. But furthermore, Kenya already has a zero tariff on maize, except that applies only to the EAC. But outside EAC, you still have about 20-25% tariff, which if that is allowed, or in this scenario where that tariff is dropped to zero, it brings opportunities for the gross margins, particularly in the animal sector. You see the increasing margins or improvement in margins, in the outlook for chickens and eggs. But that's also because maize is the main, or almost the only ingredient in feed, and it contributes a large share of the costs of the feed, as I mentioned, as well as the share of feed production. And therefore, additional maize, cheaper maize, nogal, I can say that, right? would actually contribute towards this positive story that is emerging out of Kenya. You can also see the production improving, but mainly along the dairy, sector, where again you have a large head population that is being fed when you compare it to the beef and the meat sector. But nevertheless, in the outlook, you see those improvements that are associated with the importation of GM yellow maize. On the consumption side, you also see the price, the consumer prices declining for most of those products, eggs, beef, chicken, as well as dairy. And that's because the current maize that goes into feed is actually still white. So imports would release that white maize to get into the human consumption and then reducing prices. But the cumulative overall impact, and also aligned with some of the outcomes or the challenges that Holger has identified, from the economic perspective, you see increase in jobs of up to more than 230,000. You see the economy gaining additional $342 million over the period, or in the outlook period. But where it starts, the outcome starts aligning with some of the targets for the SDGs and other domestic programs, is that the food starts to be more affordable as prices of most baskets going down. You can see both the staples, the vegetables, with the exception of only fruit and added fats, but overall, the affordability improves, as well as the dietary deprivation also decline. So, in a way, this becomes one of those tools that, when working and applied in an economy, in a targeted, prioritized, and focused manner, enables you to achieve or pursue the targets that you have set. However, the key point, and also in line with the theme for this year's baseline, is that it is one thing to plan, it is one thing to have all these ideas. If they are not followed up by action, if they are not pursued when things changed, like I mentioned initially, in terms of the shocks that we have seen over the years, basically those shocks means that the initial plan that you started with is affected. How do you adapt to that? That's what action actually allows you to do, not necessarily to drop out of the game altogether. And just combining all the cases from, for Kenya as well as Malawi, is that you get to see the outcomes or the impacts of those interventions starting to go towards the points or the challenges that under the SDGs have been identified in terms of the challenges of productivity, the issues around affordability, as well as poverty and employment. So in conclusion, I think I can also bring a loop to what Fedi has also mentioned in the context of the AAMP, Agriculture and Agro-Processing Master Plans here in South Africa, in that when you follow through, when you act, you have an opportunity to see the challenges. Or when the storm comes along, you already have a plan to deal with it, or which that way to navigate. He mentioned also the IAT in the case of South Africa, the way it can be approached, but the idea is still that the people do matter. Of course, the people depend on the economy. The economy is supported by the available natural resources, and the investment cases, when you have such evidence-based support to policy making, they get stronger. And the partnerships that we need, be it in the infrastructure development as well as in the production policy implementation, enables the future, as Fedi used to call it, the curve to be bent, to be changed one way. And hopefully that's something that we would see going forward. But the methodologies have been applied, and we have not only done it in Kenya and Malawi, but Tanzania, Ethiopia, as well as, who am I forgetting? Yes, so with those, then I think that is the end of my presentation here. I would like to call Aubrey to come on here to say a few words from the sponsors, and I'll come back with some housekeeping issues to close. Aubrey, thank you.
Good afternoon. Before I start, I would just need to check with Runel. I hope they take a photo of this. I think it has always been my family's wish and prayers that I would someday find my way on a stage in an art theatre. My mother enrolled me for piano lessons, accordion lessons, guitar lessons, and trumpet lessons. And I think with the trumpet lessons, after a year, the teacher actually said to my mother, she'll pay back all the money as long as I don't come back. So I think this is really, a privilege for me to be here. And I would like to, start off and say well done on the baseline. It's difficult for me today. There's two events. There's the baseline, but there's also the celebration of 20 years. And I must say, as APSA, we're quite proud being involved for the whole 20 years. And and I must thank, the people before me in APSA that had the foresight of backing BFAP, so we're fortunate for that. Then I think, we also need to celebrate the opportunity to be here and to be social today and to be able to meet up in person. I think the past couple of years showed us, that there could be a different reality. Fairly, and I remember 2020, start of COVID, and I think there was an online baseline. And load shedding wasn't a real issue in 2020. There was some, and as we started, I think it was load shedding also started, so it got delayed quite a bit because at that stage it wasn't such a reality. Ferdy and team, then I also need to congratulate you on the theme, Decisive Action to Forge a Sustainable Future. And if I can break it down a little bit, if we look at sustainability, if I look at the bank and the number of, our capacity that we're building around sustainability, it's very actual, it's coming. I think the challenge is to get it down to a producer level, get our producers also to start realizing, creating a baseline, the same that I think that you guys are doing, to start measure that. I think there's adverse weather effects, but I think there's also infrastructure. And I think in a bank there's also two parties, you've got the bankers and you've got the credit teams. And the bankers would put on a deal and the credit team would approve it. In so many instances, once we approve a deal, the business guys would make a little huddle and we would congratulate each other, and the credit guy that was part of the team would actually be on the side. And I think it's very much the same. I think, with people that provide, data and driven insights, we seldom forget the importance of building, that. And I think the master plan is a great example. It's around value chains, different people, different views, and how do you create that vision to bring that industry together. Then I think if I look at the word forge, and for a banker, forge could mean something totally different. But I think, in this instance, it's to create something strong, enduring, and successful. It's having one voice as the industry at the table, which I think is exceptionally important. I think the one thing that we can't do is divide ourselves up and not have one agenda. Then I think, it's also, in terms of action, that's the verb, which means that, once we've got the insights, what do we go and do in the different industries? Now, as APSA and any strategic planning, the baseline is such an important document, and I know it's been a lot of numbers and data and insights, but this book is so important to keep and refer to, in the future, especially when you sit and you plan for a little bit of a longer term. Ferdy, then I need to thank you and Tracy and the BFAP team for the baseline today. I really think, like I said, it is a document that we use fairly often, and I thank you for the hard work that's going into that. And then, as a last comment, we are proud to be associated. Relationships is very important for us with our clients, also with industry and organized agriculture. So thank you for 20 years. We're looking forward to the next 20 years. And it's not a mean feat, to survive that long. I mean, in the bank, we quite often see startups, and that the success rate is not that great, but well done, you created value. You're contributing towards the industry, and you're contributing towards South Africa. Then I think the last piece is that, a celebration is never done unless you break a bit of bread. So I hope that you can join us and celebrate, afterwards this baseline, but also the 20 years. Thank you very much.